There's a question so dangerous it can kill your entire identity in seconds. A wandering dervish named Shams asked this question to Rumi in 1244. Rumi fainted. When he woke up, the scholar was dead. What emerged was the greatest mystic in human history. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what that question was. But first, you need to understand who Rumi was before that night. Because the man who met Shams was not the Rumi you know from Instagram quotes and spiritual memes. That man hadn't been born yet. In 1244, Jalal ad-Din was one of the most respected Islamic scholars in the world. Imagine someone who had memorized the entire Quran by age 6. Someone whose father was already a renowned mystic teacher. Someone who had spent 37 years building an impeccable reputation as a traditional Islamic scholar, giving lectures to packed halls, writing commentaries on sacred texts, living the life of perfect religious orthodoxy. This was a man who lived entirely in his head. Knowledge was his God. Scholarship was his worship. He had students traveling from across the Islamic world just to sit in his lectures. He was successful, respected, admired. He had everything a religious scholar could want, and he was completely asleep. Then, on November 15th, 1244, everything changed. Rumi was riding through the streets of Konya on his donkey, probably thinking about his next lecture, when a wild-looking man stepped out of the shadows and grabbed the bridle of his donkey. The man's name was Shams of Tabriz. He was everything Rumi was not. Where Rumi was respected, Shams was rejected. Where Rumi was settled, Shams was a wanderer. Where Rumi lived in books, Shams lived in direct experience. Where Rumi spoke the language of the mind, Shams spoke the language of the heart. And this wild mystic looked into the eyes of the great scholar and asked him a question that would shatter everything Rumi thought he knew about God, about himself, about reality itself. But before I tell you what that question was, you need to understand what happened next. Because when Shams asked this question, Rumi didn't just hear words. He felt something break open inside his chest. Witnesses say he turned pale, began to tremble, and then collapsed unconscious. When Rumi woke up, he looked into Shams' eyes and saw something that changed him forever. He saw himself. Not the scholarly self he had spent decades perfecting. He saw his true self, the self that had been sleeping under all those books, all those lectures, all that knowledge. And in that moment, the scholar died. What was born was a lover. So what was this question that had such devastating power? What could Shams have asked that literally knocked Rumi unconscious and changed the course of mystical history? There are different versions of this story, but the most authentic one, recorded by Rumi's closest disciples, goes like this. Shams looked at Rumi and asked, "Who was greater, Bayazid Bistami or Muhammad?" Now, this might not seem like a dangerous question to you, but understand what Shams was really asking. Bayezid was a famous Sufi who claimed, "Glory be to me. How great is my majesty," essentially claiming to be God. Muhammad, of course, was the prophet of Islam, but he always maintained his humanity, saying, "I am just a man like you." Rumi, the good scholar, gave the orthodox answer. Muhammad was greater, obviously. He was the prophet. Bayezid was just a mystic who got carried away. But Shams wasn't finished. He pressed deeper. Then why is it that Muhammad, for all his closeness to God, still asked for forgiveness 70 times a day and said, "We have not known you as you deserve to be known"? While Bayezid, in his spiritual intoxication, declared, "Glory be to me. How great is my majesty." Which one truly knew God? This is when Rumi fainted, because Shams had just shattered everything Rumi thought he understood about the spiritual path. He had revealed the difference between the sober path of the prophet, always aware of the infinite distance between human and divine, and the intoxicated path of the mystic who realizes that there is no distance at all, because in the deepest truth, there is no separation between lover and beloved. Muhammad's humility came from seeing God's infinite greatness compared to human limitation. Bayezid's ecstasy came from disappearing entirely into that greatness until only God remained. Both were right. Both were necessary. But Rumi had never seen this paradox before. His entire worldview, built on clear categories, proper boundaries, orthodox positions, crumbled in an instant. When Rumi regained consciousness, he looked at Shams with completely different eyes. This wasn't just a wandering madman. This was someone who lived in the very paradox that Rumi had spent his life trying to resolve with his mind. This was someone who had died to himself so completely that God lived through him. And Rumi wanted what Shams had, not the knowledge about God that had filled his head for 37 years, but the direct taste of God that burned in Shams' heart. What followed was one of the most intense spiritual relationships in history. For 3 years, Rumi and Shams were inseparable. They would disappear into spiritual conversations that lasted for days. They would whirl together until they both collapsed in ecstasy. They would sit in silence, gazing into each other's eyes, seeing God reflected back and forth until it was impossible to tell who was the mirror and who was the face. Rumi's students were horrified. Their dignified teacher had become a madman. Where were his scholarly lectures? Why was he spending all his time with this wild dervish? Why had he stopped acting like a proper religious authority? They didn't understand that Rumi wasn't becoming less religious. He was becoming more real. The Rumi they knew, the scholar, the teacher, the respectable religious leader, had been a mask. A very beautiful, very convincing mask, but a mask nonetheless. The real Rumi was what emerged when that mask fell away. A man drunk on divine love. A man who had tasted what lay beyond all his books and concepts. A man who had discovered that God is not something you think about. God is something you become. But this intensity couldn't last. Rumi's students, jealous of Shams' influence, began to plot against him. They made Shams feel unwelcome, spreading rumors, creating such hostility that eventually Shams had to leave Konya. Rumi was devastated. He had found his other half, the mirror that showed him his true face, and now that mirror was gone. He sent letters begging Shams to return. He traveled personally to Damascus to bring him back, and for a brief golden period, Shams did return. But the hostility from Rumi's followers was even worse the second time. And then, in 1248, Shams disappeared forever. Some say he left quietly, in the night. Others whisper that he was murdered by jealous disciples, who couldn't bear seeing their master's devotion to this wild stranger. Rumi never saw Shams again. But this loss, this unbearable separation from his beloved, became the fire that forged his greatest spiritual insights. Because Rumi discovered something profound in his grief. He discovered that Shams had never really been outside of him. The divine presence that he had seen in Shams' eyes was actually his own deepest nature, reflected back to him through the mirror of spiritual friendship. This is when Rumi began to write. Not scholarly commentaries, but poetry that poured directly from his burning heart. Poetry that expressed the pain of separation from the beloved, but also the joy of recognizing that the beloved was never really separate. I searched for God and found only myself. I searched for myself and found only God. The question Shams had asked, who was greater, the sober prophet or the intoxicated mystic, had revealed the deepest secret of the spiritual path. There is no path. There is no distance to travel. There is no God. Out there, to find God, there is only the recognition that what you are seeking is what you are. The lover, the beloved, and the love itself are one. But this recognition doesn't come through thinking. It doesn't come through studying. It comes through the kind of radical friendship that Rumi found with Shams. It comes through having someone look into your eyes with such presence, such truth, such uncompromising love, that all your masks fall away and you see your own divine face reflected back. This is why Rumi always called Shams his teacher, even though Shams never taught him anything in the conventional sense. Shams didn't give him new information. He didn't share secret techniques or esoteric knowledge. He simply loved Rumi with such intensity, such presence, such divine recognition, that Rumi remembered who he really was. And when Shams disappeared, Rumi realized the ultimate truth. Shams was never a separate person. Shams was Rumi's own divine nature, peering in human form to wake him up to himself. This is why, in his later poetry, Rumi often signed his poems with Shams' name instead of his own. He had realized that there was no Rumi separate from Shams, no seeker separate from the sought, no lover separate from the beloved. The question that had killed the scholar in Rumi had given birth to the greatest mystical poet in human history. But more than that, it had revealed the secret that lies at the heart of all authentic spirituality. You are not a person having mystical experiences. You are a mystical experience temporarily forgetting your true nature. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, life sends you someone who loves you enough to ask you the dangerous question that shatters that forgetting. Shams asked Rumi, who truly knew God, the one who maintained separation or the one who dissolved into union? But the real question underneath was, who are you really? The mask you've been wearing, or the divine consciousness that has been wearing the mask? Most of us spend our entire lives avoiding this question. We build elaborate identities: successful person, spiritual person, good person, intelligent person. And we defend these identities fiercely because we think they are who we are. But there's a deeper identity underneath all these roles. Identity that Rumi discovered when his scholarly mask was stripped away. The identity that is pure consciousness, pure love, pure being. The identity that is actually not an identity at all, but the very awareness in which all identities appear and disappear. This is what Shams saw when he looked into Rumi's eyes that day by the fountain. He saw through the scholarly identity, too, the divine consciousness that was wearing it. And he asked the question that would force Rumi to see it too. The night that changed. Rumi forever wasn't really about Shams asking a clever question. It was about one heart recognizing itself in another. Heart and refusing to look away. It was about the courage to let everything you think you are die, so that everything you truly are can be born. And perhaps that's the real message of Rumi's story. Not that you need to find your own Shams, though such friendships are the greatest gift life can offer, but that you need to be willing to ask yourself the dangerous questions that your comfortable identity doesn't want to hear. Who are you really? Underneath all your roles and achievements and carefully constructed self-image, who is the one who is aware of all your thoughts and feelings and experiences? Who is looking through your eyes right now? These are the questions that can kill everything false in you and give birth to everything real. These are the questions that turned a respectable scholar into a mystic whose love poetry still sets hearts on fire 800 years later. The Rumi, you know, the one whose quotes fill your social media feeds, was born on that November day in 1244, when a wild mystic asked him a question so dangerous it literally knocked him unconscious. Maybe it's time to ask yourself the same question. Not the surface question about who is greater, but the deep question about who you really are when all your masks fall away. Are you ready for what you might find? Are you ready to let the false self die so the true self can be born? Because that's what real spirituality is. Not adding new beliefs or practices or experiences to who you think you are, but having the courage to discover who you are when everything you think you are falls away. This is the secret that Shams whispered to Rumi that day by the fountain. This is the question that changed everything. And this is the invitation that waits for you right now, in this moment. If you're brave enough to stop running from it, that the scholar in you might faint when you truly see it. But what emerges from that beautiful destruction will be more real, more alive, more authentically you than anything you've ever been before. Welcome to the night that changes everything. Welcome to the question that kills everything false and births everything true. Welcome to the path that Rumi walked, from the death of who he thought he was to the birth of who he really is. The question is waiting. Are you ready to hear it?